This is LeBron James, one of the greatest and most durable basketball players who has ever lived.
Face these guys up. Toes like Rikers Island, overpopulated.
And these are his feet.
My eyes!
That photo went around the internet because it's funny, but roughly 1 in 5 adults worldwide has that same deformity of the big toe, and depending on how it's measured, foot pain affects anywhere between 1 in 10 to nearly 1 in 3 adults. So if this can happen to LeBron, what are your shoes doing to you? In a few minutes, I'll show you 600-year-old skeletons connecting deformities in the foot to fractures in the wrist, and later, why some companies selling the solution began promising more than their research could support. Back to LeBron. Obviously, genetics, injuries, and 2 decades of professional basketball all matter here, but this is the shape his feet have spent those 20 years being placed inside. The LeBron 23 is a piece of performance machinery. It uses full-length ZoomX foam, a carbon fiber plate, and a crown-shaped containment system designed to stabilize the foot during explosive jumps, stops, and changes of direction. That performance depends partly on controlling the foot. The shoe locks it down, has about 7.5 millimeters of heel-to-toe drop, and tapers towards the toes. Now put that outline of the shoe over the outline of a human foot, and the conflict is pretty obvious. The foot is widest at the toes, while the shoe is narrowest at the toes. These things don't just kill your chances at a feet pick career, they change how force travels through your entire body. And before we go any further, check your own shoes. If you take the removable insole out of the shoe you wear most and put it on the floor, while standing barefoot on it with your full weight, you'll see how the outline matches up to your feet. If your toes spill over the edges, or you have to squeeze together to stay inside the outline, then your foot is wider than your toe box allows. Now if your foot just failed that test, tap the like button because it gets worse. If we take a second look at LeBron's foot, his big toe appears to drift towards the smaller toes. The middle toes look buckled and crowded. What we can see is consistent with hallux valgus, alongside overlapping or hammer toe-like deformities in his other toes. Quick distinction most people don't know, if the bump is on the side of the big toe joint, that's a bunion. A bump on top can be associated with arthritis or a bone spur. Both can limit how far the toe bends. Now, the big toe matters more than almost anyone realizes. During the final phase of every step, your weight moves through the forefoot towards the big toe. As that toe bends, it tensions the tissue under your foot, stiffens the arch, and turns the foot into a lever for push-off. If that toe becomes angled, painful, stiff, or weak, pressure can shift towards the smaller toes and the body can start compensating. Researchers have documented an extreme version of this in a 21-year-old Japanese equestrian who lost most of his big toe in an accident. After the injury, pressure shifted away from the inside of his foot and towards his second toe. His center of pressure became less stable. Therefore, he spent less time supported by his injured leg. It came to the point he couldn't balance on it for even 10 seconds. Within a month, he developed pain in the knee above it. His physical therapy didn't just target the foot, it retrained his balance, leg, hip, and trunk because the injury had changed his entire movement strategy. After 12 weeks, his walking became more symmetrical, but his body had essentially needed to learn a new way to walk and hold itself. A review of 29 studies involving partial foot amputations found the same general pattern. Losing the smaller toes usually caused relatively minor changes, but losing the big toe produced a much larger loss of forward and lateral push-off, with the pressure shifting towards the second and third metatarsals. A bunion is obviously not the same as losing a toe, but again, if that toe becomes severely angled, stiff, painful, or weak, it's not going to load the same on the ground or propel the body the way it used to. In one study, adults with bunions showed roughly 20% more front-to-back postural sway than adults without it. In another, researchers followed 312 older adults for a year. These adults who fell during follow-up had approximately 22% less big toe strength than those who didn't. Bunions were associated with more than twice the risk of falling, while toe strength and lesser toe deformities also helped predict who would go down. In other words, ugly toes are way more than just a cosmetic issue. They're part of your body's foundation. And this isn't new. People have been reshaping their feet with fashionable shoes for centuries. Remember those skeletons I mentioned earlier? A team from Cambridge University examined the foot bones of 177 adults buried in and around medieval Cambridge. Among people buried between the 11th and 13th centuries, only 6% showed evidence of bunions. But among those buried during the 14th and 15th centuries, about 200 years later, the number jumped to 27%. It's the same city, just different eras. And one obvious thing had changed: fashion. Shoes went from functional rounded toes to long elegant points known as poulaines. By the late 14th century, a pointed narrow toe box had spread across almost every type of footwear in that area. Now, the social pattern was almost too perfect here, because only 3% of people buried in rural cemetery had bunions. But inside wealthy Augustinian friaries, where people had greater access to these fashionable shoes, the bunion rate reached 43%. That study was titled Fancy Shoes and Painful Feet, Hallux Valgus, and Fracture Risk. Now, the second half of that title is where this stops being a story about ugly toes. Across the skeletons the researchers assessed, 52% with bunions had at least one healed fracture. Among those without the deformity, it was only 31%. The association was statistically significant among people over 45, and many of the injuries appeared on the upper limbs. The kind of fracture you might expect when you lose your balance and reach out to catch yourself. Now, obviously, these skeletons cannot tell us exactly how each fracture happened, but the association echoes modern research that connects bunions with poor balance and higher risk of falls. That's the potential reach of a deformity beginning at the foot. Now, medieval Europe wasn't the most extreme or even the most recent example. As recently as the early 1900s, millions of girls in China were still undergoing foot binding. In many communities, an extremely small foot was considered feminine, refined, and desirable. It could improve a girl's marriage prospects and produce the delicate, swaying walk associated with upper-class beauty. That ideal was called the Golden Lotus. The embroidered shoes made for these feet were sometimes so small that modern museum visitors mistake them for children's shoes. But these were not naturally small feet placed inside small shoes. Binding often began between ages 4 and 8 while the skeleton was still developing. The 4 smaller toes were folded beneath the sole. Long strips of cloth pulled the heel and forefoot toward one another and forced the arch upward. The bandages were repeatedly removed and reapplied, each time tighter and tighter. In severe cases, bones fractured, toes dislocated, and the entire foot was permanently remodeled. In 1997, researchers examined some of the last surviving women with bound feet in Beijing. Compared with women of the same age whose feet had not been bound, they were way more likely to fall. They had greater difficulty squatting, they were less capable of rising from a chair without assistance, and their functional reach was 14% lower. On top of that, they had approximately 5% less bone density at the hip, compounding the danger if they did fall. It's a different mechanism with vastly different severity here, but the same underlying principle. Repeatedly force a developing foot into a shape, and the bones and surrounding tissues adapt to it. In extreme cases, balance and mobility suffer with it as well. So how did we arrive at a footwear industry that still expects the foot to adapt to the shoe? For more than 2 centuries, most European shoes were made on forms called straight lasts, with little visible distinction between the left and right foot. Once heels became fashionable in the 1600s, shoemaking became more complicated, and straight forms remained common into the 19th century. Some historical accounts even describe wealthy owners having servants break in painful new shoes before wearing them. Today, for certain dress shoes, boots, and Chelsea boots, the break-in process still exists. It's just that now the person absorbing that pain is you. And the reason isn't a conspiracy, it's economics. Modern shoe lasts are compromises between anatomy, styling, athletic performance, and manufacturing costs. When those priorities conflict, the adaptable foot is often expected to absorb that difference. Doctors noticed these consequences a long time ago. At the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, physician Phil Hoffman examined 186 pairs of feet belonging to people who had rarely or never worn shoes. It's worth saying that many of these people were being publicly exhibited, which is its own ugly piece of history. Hoffman argued that children's feet began with similar shape and function, but major differences appeared after regular shoe wearing began. Later in 1992, researchers collected footprints from 2,300 Indian children that supported the same result. Flat feet were recorded in 13.2% of children wearing closed-toed shoes, 8.2% of those wearing slippers, 6% wearing sandals, and only 2.8% for those who went barefoot. That doesn't prove the shoes cause every case, but the more enclosed the foot was, the higher the observed rate of foot deformity. And a later review found that across several studied populations, approximately 63 to 72% of people wore shoes that failed to accommodate either the length or the width of their feet. So while our manufacturing process has changed, the expectations of how people wear and buy shoes have remained mostly the same. Narrow toe boxes came into fashion and we just kept going with it. Nowadays, your foot adapts to the shoe you buy. Or does it? Over the past 20 years, a growing part of the footwear industry has tried to reverse that relationship. They call their products barefoot or minimalist shoes. And there's a pattern in how these companies started. Zero Shoes began after Steven Sashen returned to sprinting in his 40s, struggled with repeated injuries, and experimented with running barefoot. He started making Huarache-style sandals from thin rubber and cord, first for himself, then for other runners. Altra started in a family running store in Utah. Golden Harper became convinced that elevated heels and tapered toe boxes were changing how customers moved, so he put conventional running shoes into a toaster oven, melted off the outsole, removed material from the heel, and rebuilt them so heel and forefoot sat at roughly the same height. Vivo Barefoot was founded by Galahad and Asher Clark, members of the family behind Clark's, a shoemaking dynasty dating all the way back to 1825. Their family helped build the conventional footwear industry, but they decided to rebel against it. And it nearly killed them. When the barefoot boom looked ready to explode around 2012, the cousins committed heavily to inventory. The demand didn't arrive on schedule. The company came close to bankruptcy and survived on outside investment. And then there was Vibram 5 Fingers, which gave each toe its own compartment on a thin segmented sole. Here we have different companies with different origin stories, but the same commercial argument, that the shoe should adapt to the foot and not the other way around. Now, here's the evidence behind their argument. In a 2021 University of Liverpool study, 22 healthy adults were given minimalist shoes and were asked to wear them for at least 70% of their shod time over 6 months. Another 24 continued in conventional footwear. The conventional group showed no meaningful change. The minimalist group increased its measured toe flexion strength by an average of 57.4%. That's a number that becomes 60% stronger feet in a lot of their marketing. Now, this was actually just a small study of 22 healthy adults. The groups weren't described as randomized, and foot strength meant one specific test of isometric toe flexion force. It did not demonstrate 60% fewer injuries, 60% better balance, or 60% fewer deformities. The participants' feet didn't become significantly wider over the course of these 6 months either. So there is a gap between what the study measures and what the marketing implies. And in another study done in 2010, they found that habitually barefoot runners often landed on the forefoot and generated different collision forces from conventionally shod runners who landed on their heels. But the study didn't test whether barefoot runners suffered fewer injuries. It tested foot strikes and forces. Its acknowledgments also disclosed funding from private organizations, including Vibram USA. Now, industry funding doesn't automatically make a study false, but it matters when results become a commercial promise about preventing injuries. Later on, Vibram created a $3.7 million settlement fund after a lawsuit challenged their health claims about 5 Fingers. The company denied wrongdoing but agreed to stop making unsupported claims that the shoe strengthened muscles or reduced injuries. The overreach in this field usually begins with people who are mostly right and then continue just 1 or 2 steps beyond the evidence. Now, can minimalist shoes make some foot muscles stronger? Yes. Have they been proven to prevent injuries or reverse every deformity? No. So barefoot shoes aside, what can you actually do for your foot health? A wide shoe and a wide toe box are not the same thing. Ordering a wide size may increase the shoe's overall volume while leaving the same tapered front. We gotta use the insole test. Your toes shouldn't spill over the sides, and you should have some space beyond the longest toe. Number 2 is safe barefoot time. Going barefoot at home gives your toes space to spread and makes the muscles of your feet work without the structure of a shoe doing as much for them. Number 3 is strength. Rolling a lacrosse ball under your foot for 60 to 90 seconds is a useful form of fascia release. Towel scrunches are also a useful exercise to train the plantar muscles. We should also train our calves. Biomechanical models estimate that the soleus, the deep calf muscle, can produce forces around 6 times body weight during running and more at higher speeds. Number 4 is change cushioning and heel height last. In one study, runners were given 10 weeks to transition into Vibram 5 Fingers. 10 of the 19 minimalist runners developed increased signs of bone stress on MRIs compared with 1 of 17 runners who stayed in conventional shoes. You do have to build the capacity for a thin flat shoe. We can start with short walks, keep your old shoes in rotation, and increase time gradually. So where does this leave us? Well, LeBron needs a shoe that lets him cut at full speed. A construction worker or a nurse standing on concrete all day may need more cushioning. The best shoe is not automatically the most barefoot shoe or the shoe with the most technology. It's the shoe that fits your foot, fits the job, and matches what your body is prepared to handle.